The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic one final time. 23 years he had served as a Queen's Guard, 23 years of standing motionless for hours, enduring tourist taunts, weather extremes, and personal struggles while maintaining the perfect stoic expression that had become his trademark. James had always prided himself on his unwavering discipline. During his early years, fellow guards would whisper stories of colleagues who had broken composure, some fainting from heat exhaustion, others cracking under the pressure of persistent tourists trying to make them laugh or react. But James was different. He had mastered the art of mental separation, learning to retreat into his own thoughts while his body remained a statue-like sentinel. The palace grounds buzzed with their usual morning activity. Tour groups gathered near the gates, cameras ready to capture the iconic red-coated figures who had become symbols of British tradition and unwavering duty. Children pointed excitedly at the tall black hats, while adults marveled at the guards' ability to remain completely still despite the chaos around them. What most visitors never realized was that, beneath those perfectly pressed uniforms and expressionless faces were real people with real lives, real problems, and real emotions. James carried his own burden. His 8-year-old daughter Emma had been battling leukemia for the past 2 years. The medical bills were mounting, his marriage was strained, and every day felt like a fight between his duty to serve and his desperate need to be with his family. That particular morning, as James took his position outside the palace gates, he noticed something different in the crowd. A small girl, no older than his Emma, sat in a wheelchair near the fence. Her head was wrapped in a colorful scarf, and despite her obvious illness, she wore the biggest smile he had seen in months. She was pointing at him with pure joy, whispering excitedly to who appeared to be her grandmother. The grandmother, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes, was explaining something to the child. James couldn't hear the words, but he could see the love and concern in her expression. The scene reminded him painfully of his own situation, the countless hospital visits, the brave face his daughter put on despite her pain, the way his mother-in-law had become their rock during the darkest moments. As the morning progressed, James found himself stealing glances at the little girl. She never lost her enthusiasm, waving at him every few minutes despite his complete lack of response. Her grandmother would gently remind her that the guards couldn't wave back, but the child didn't seem discouraged. She was simply happy to be there, happy to see him. Around midday, something unexpected happened. The girl's grandmother approached one of the other guards and spoke quietly to him. James watched from his peripheral vision as the guard nodded slightly and then walked over to speak with the sergeant on duty. Within minutes, an official palace representative appeared and had a brief conversation with the grandmother. James felt a shift in the atmosphere. Other tourists began to notice the special attention being given to the elderly woman and the sick child. Some started taking pictures, sensing that something meaningful was about to unfold. The palace staff, known for their strict adherence to protocol, seemed to be making an exception. The grandmother returned to her granddaughter's side, and James could see tears forming in the older woman's eyes. She knelt beside the wheelchair and spoke softly to the child, who immediately began clapping her hands with excitement. Whatever news had been shared, it had brought immense joy to both of them. As James stood there, maintaining his rigid posture, he couldn't help but think about his own daughter lying in a hospital bed just a few miles away. Emma would be starting another round of chemotherapy that afternoon, and he wouldn't be there to hold her hand like he had promised. His wife Sarah would once again face their daughter's fear and pain alone, while he stood here, playing the role of an unfeeling statue. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, trained to show no emotion, to be the perfect embodiment of strength and stability, while inside he was crumbling. Every day he put on this uniform, he was reminded of the sacrifice that came with duty, not just the physical demands, but the emotional cost of being unavailable when his family needed him most. The little girl in the wheelchair continued to watch him throughout the afternoon, her grandmother taking pictures and videos of her granddaughter's obvious fascination with the guards. James found himself wondering about their story. Was this a special trip planned because the child was sick? Was this perhaps a final wish? A chance to see the famous guards before something unthinkable happened? As his shift neared its end, James reflected on the thousands of people who had passed by his post over the years. Most saw him as nothing more than a tourist attraction, a living piece of British heritage to be photographed and forgotten. But occasionally someone would look at him differently, with respect, with understanding, or like this little girl, with pure, uncomplicated joy. The afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, and James knew his replacement would arrive soon. As he prepared mentally for the end of his duty, he caught sight of the grandmother approaching the guard station once more. This time she was carrying something in her hands, what appeared to be a small envelope. The changing of the guard ceremony had always been a moment of quiet transition for James, but today felt different. As his replacement, Corporal Williams, approached with the characteristic measured steps that had been drilled into them during training, James felt an unusual reluctance to leave his post. The little girl in the wheelchair was still there, still watching, still smiling despite what must have been a long and tiring day for someone in her condition. During the brief handover conversation that occurred away from public view, Corporal Williams mentioned something that made James's heart skip. "The sergeant wants to see you before you leave today," Williams whispered. Something about a special request from a visitor. James nodded, maintaining his professional composure, but inside his mind raced. Special requests were rare and usually involved dignitaries or official business. He couldn't imagine what this could be about, though his eyes involuntarily drifted back to the grandmother and her granddaughter. After the ceremony concluded, and James had been officially relieved of duty, he made his way to Sergeant Morrison's office. Morrison was a veteran guard himself, someone who had worked his way up through the ranks and understood both the pressures and the privileges that came with their unique position. "Mitchell," Morrison began, gesturing for James to sit. "We've had an unusual request today. That elderly woman out there, Mrs. Patterson, she's asked if one of our guards might be willing to break protocol for just a moment." He paused, studying James's reaction. Her granddaughter, Lucy, is 7 years old. She's been fighting brain cancer for the past year. James felt his stomach tighten. The similarities to his own situation were impossible to ignore. Morrison continued. Mrs. Patterson explained that Lucy has always been fascinated by the Queen's Guard. She's seen them on television, in books, and today was supposed to be a special treat. Her first time seeing the real guards in person. "The thing is, James, tomorrow Lucy goes in for a major surgery. The doctors—" Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "The prognosis isn't certain." The office fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic beyond the palace walls. James stared at his hands, thinking of his own Emma, thinking of all the times he'd wished someone would bend the rules just slightly to bring a moment of happiness into his daughter's difficult world. "What kind of break in protocol are we talking about, sir?" James asked quietly. Morrison leaned back in his chair. "She's asked if one of the guards might be willing to simply acknowledge Lucy, perhaps a small nod or a moment of eye contact. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would compromise the dignity of the position, but something to show Lucy that the guard she's been watching all day knows she's there." James thought about the strict training they'd all received, years of conditioning to remain absolutely motionless, to show no reaction regardless of what happened around them. Guards had maintained their posts during protests, severe weather, and even medical emergencies. The ability to remain unmoved was considered the ultimate mark of professionalism. But James also thought about humanity, about the real purpose behind their service. They weren't just ceremonial figures. They were protectors, servants of the crown, and by extension, servants of the people. What good was protecting tradition if it meant ignoring the very people that tradition was meant to serve? "Sir," James said finally, "I'd like to volunteer." Morrison smiled slightly. "I thought you might. But James, you should know, there are photographers out there. Tourist cameras, possibly media. If you do this, it might be captured and shared widely. The palace will support you, but it could become quite public." James nodded. He understood the implications, but they seemed insignificant compared to the opportunity to bring joy to a sick child and her worried grandmother. 20 minutes later, James found himself back in full uniform, walking across the courtyard toward his usual post. Mrs. Patterson had positioned Lucy's wheelchair in the perfect spot, close enough to clearly see the guard, but respectful of the boundaries that normally existed between the public and the guards. As James took his position, he could see Lucy's eyes widen with excitement. She whispered something to her grandmother, who smiled and nodded encouragingly. Several tourists had noticed that something special was happening and began gathering around, phones and cameras ready. James stood in his traditional stance, rifle held precisely, face forward, every inch the perfect Queen's Guard. But inside, he was preparing himself for something he had never done in 23 years of service. He was preparing to break character, to show emotion, to acknowledge another human being while on duty. The minutes ticked by slowly. James could feel the weight of anticipation from the small crowd that had gathered. Lucy sat patiently in her wheelchair, her small hands clasped together, her eyes never leaving his face. Mrs. Patterson stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her granddaughter's shoulder. James thought about timing, about making sure his gesture would be meaningful, but not disruptive to his duties or to other visitors. He thought about his own daughter, probably just finishing her treatment for the day, probably asking her mother when Daddy would come home, and then, in a moment that would soon be seen around the world, James Mitchell made a decision that would define not just his career, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. He turned his head slightly toward Lucy, looked directly into her eyes, and gave her the smallest, gentlest nod he could manage while maintaining the dignity of his position. The effect was immediate and electric. Lucy's face broke into the biggest smile imaginable. Her hands flew to her mouth in surprise and delight, and tears began streaming down Mrs. Patterson's cheeks. The crowd around them erupted in quiet applause and excited whispers. The moment James's eyes met Lucy's and he gave that gentle nod, something shifted in the atmosphere around the palace gates. What had started as a simple gesture of kindness between a guard and a sick child quickly became something much larger. The dozen or so tourists who witnessed the interaction immediately began sharing photos and videos on social media, and within hours the story was spreading across the internet. But James was unaware of the digital wildfire he had ignited. After completing his shift, he drove straight to the children's hospital where Emma was receiving treatment. The stark white corridors and antiseptic smell were a jarring contrast to the historic grandeur of the palace. But this was where his heart truly resided, in room 312, where his 8-year-old daughter was fighting the battle of her life. Sarah, his wife, looked up as he entered the room. The exhaustion in her eyes told the story of another difficult day. Emma was sleeping, her small body dwarfed by the hospital bed, various tubes and monitors creating a web of medical technology around her. "How did it go today?" Sarah whispered, moving closer to James. "Better than expected," James replied softly, taking her hand. He wanted to tell her about Lucy, about the moment of connection he'd felt, about how seeing another sick child had somehow made him feel less alone in their struggle. But Emma stirred and the moment passed. Meanwhile, across London, Mrs. Patterson was helping Lucy get ready for bed in their hotel room. The little girl hadn't stopped talking about her encounter with the guard since they left the palace. She had insisted on looking at the photos her grandmother had taken at least a dozen times, pointing excitedly at the image that captured the exact moment James had acknowledged her. "Grandma, do you think he has children?" Lucy asked as her grandmother tucked her into bed. "I don't know, sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson replied, smoothing Lucy's scarf. "But I think he understood how special today was for you." "I think he was sad," Lucy said with the startling perceptiveness that children sometimes possess. "His eyes looked like Mommy's eyes did when she was sick." Mrs. Patterson felt her throat tighten. Lucy's mother, her own daughter, had lost her battle with cancer just 8 months earlier. This trip to London was meant to be a celebration of Lucy's progress, a chance to make happy memories before the upcoming surgery that would determine so much about her future. Back at the hospital, James sat beside Emma's bed, watching her sleep and thinking about the day's events. The parallel between his situation and what he'd witnessed at the palace wasn't lost on him. 2 families, 2 sick little girls, 2 sets of people trying to find moments of joy and hope in the midst of overwhelming uncertainty. His phone buzzed with a text message from his colleague, Williams. "Mate, you need to see this. Check your email." James quietly stepped into the hallway and opened his email to find messages from friends, family members, and even strangers. Someone had forwarded him a link to a news article with the headline, "Queen's Guard Breaks Protocol for Dying Child." The story had been picked up by major news outlets, and the photo of his interaction with Lucy was being shared thousands of times. Initially, James felt a surge of panic. Had he made a mistake? Would there be disciplinary action? But as he read the comments and responses, he realized something remarkable was happening. People weren't criticizing his breach of protocol, they were celebrating it. "This is what real service looks like," one comment read. "This guard understands that rules should serve humanity, not the other way around." Another person had written, "My son has been in treatment for 2 years. Thank you for showing that there are still people who care about sick children." The story was resonating with parents of sick children around the world, with veterans who understood the conflict between duty and compassion, and with ordinary people who were touched by this simple act of human kindness. By the next morning, the story had reached international news outlets. James arrived at work to find Sergeant Morrison waiting with a smile and a cup of coffee. "Well, Mitchell," Morrison said, "you've certainly made an impression. The palace has been fielding calls all morning, interview requests, thank you letters, and even some criticism from traditionalists who think you've compromised the dignity of the guard." James's heart sank. "Sir, I hope I haven't caused problems for the regiment." "On the contrary," Morrison replied. "The palace staff has been monitoring the public response, and it's been overwhelmingly positive. More importantly, we received a call this morning from Mrs. Patterson." Morrison paused, his expression becoming more serious. "Lucy's surgery was moved up to this afternoon. The doctors felt it was necessary to operate sooner than planned. Mrs. Patterson wanted to pass along Lucy's thanks, and to let you know that your simple gesture gave her granddaughter the strength she needed for what's ahead." James felt tears threatening to form. He thought about Emma, about all the small kindnesses that had sustained his family through their darkest days. Nurses who stayed late to read bedtime stories, doctors who took extra time to explain procedures, janitors who always had a joke to share. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "The hospital where Lucy is having her surgery has reached out. They've invited you to visit her before the operation if you're willing. They think it might help calm her nerves." James didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, sir." As they drove across London toward the Children's Hospital, a different one from where Emma was being treated, James reflected on how one small act of human compassion had created ripple effects he never could have anticipated. He was about to meet Lucy again, this time not as a stoic guard maintaining distance, but as one human being offering support to another. The Children's Hospital felt different from the one where Emma received treatment, but the atmosphere was heartbreakingly familiar. The hushed conversations, the worried faces of parents, the artificial cheerfulness of staff trying to maintain hope in the face of childhood illness. James walked through the corridors in his civilian clothes, feeling strangely vulnerable without his uniform's protective formality. Mrs. Patterson met him at the nurse's station, her eyes red from crying but her smile genuine and warm. "Sergeant Mitchell, I can't thank you enough for coming. Lucy has been asking for you all morning." "Please call me James," he replied softly. "How is she doing?" "Nervous, but excited to see you. The doctors explained what they need to do today, and she's been very brave. But I think having something positive to focus on is helping her cope." As they walked toward Lucy's room, Mrs. Patterson continued, "I don't know if you have children of your own, but what you did yesterday, it reminded Lucy that there are good people in the world who care about her. That might seem small to you, but for a child facing what she's facing, it means everything." James felt his chest tighten. "I do have a daughter," he said quietly. "She's 8 and she's been fighting leukemia for 2 years. When I saw Lucy yesterday, I saw my Emma. I couldn't just stand there and pretend she didn't exist." Mrs. Patterson stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, my dear, I had no idea. How is your daughter doing?" "Taking it one day at a time," James replied. "Like Lucy, I suppose." They reached Lucy's room to find her sitting up in bed, wearing a hospital gown decorated with cartoon characters and still sporting her colorful headscarf. Her face lit up when she saw James, and she clapped her hands together with delight. "You came. You really came," Lucy exclaimed. "Grandma said you might, but I wasn't sure if guards were allowed to visit people." James approached her bed, marveling at how different this interaction felt compared to their first encounter. Yesterday, he had been a statue that briefly came to life. Today he was just a man talking to a brave little girl. "Of course I came," James said, pulling up a chair. "I wanted to make sure you were okay and to wish you luck with your surgery today. Are you still a guard when you're not wearing your big hat?" Lucy asked with the wonderful directness of childhood. James laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in weeks. I'm always a guard, but right now I'm just James, and I'm here as your friend. Lucy beamed at this declaration. I've never had a guard friend before. Do you know the Queen? I've seen her, but we don't have tea together or anything like that, James replied, enjoying the normalcy of the conversation. Tell me about yourself, Lucy. What do you like to do when you're not in the hospital? For the next hour, James and Lucy talked about everything except illness and surgery. Lucy told him about her pet rabbit named Mr. Whiskers, her favorite books, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. James shared stories about his life as a guard, the funny tourists, the strange weather he'd endured, and yes, the times when pigeons had tried to nest in his hat. Mrs. Patterson watched from her chair by the window, occasionally taking photos, but mostly just observing this unlikely friendship. She could see how much joy Lucy was getting from the visit, but she also noticed something else. James seemed to be finding comfort in the interaction as well. There was a lightness in his expression that suggested he needed this connection as much as Lucy did. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Lucy, sweetie, we need to start getting you ready for your surgery now. The mood in the room shifted immediately. Lucy's cheerful chatter stopped and fear crept into her eyes. James could see her small hands beginning to tremble. I'm scared, Lucy whispered, looking between James and her grandmother. James moved his chair closer to her bed. It's okay to be scared, Lucy. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means you're afraid, but you're going to do it anyway. Were you scared when you became a guard? Lucy asked. Terrified, James admitted. The first time I had to stand in front of all those people, knowing they were watching me, waiting to see if I would make a mistake. I thought I might faint right there, but you didn't? No, I didn't, and do you know why? Lucy shook her head. Because I remembered that sometimes the most important thing we can do is be strong for other people. Yesterday, when I saw you watching me, you were being strong for your grandmother. Today, you're going to be strong for all the other children who might face the same surgery someday. Lucy considered this seriously. So I'm like a guard too? You're braver than any guard I know, James said honestly. As the medical team prepared to take Lucy to surgery, she asked James to lean down so she could whisper something in his ear. Please tell your daughter Emma that Lucy the guard says hello. James pulled back, startled. How did you know about Emma? Grown-ups think children don't listen, but we do, Lucy said with a wise smile. Tell her that we're both fighting the same battle and we're going to win together. Tears rolled down James's cheeks as he kissed Lucy's forehead. I'll tell her. And Lucy, when you wake up, I want you to remember that you have a guard friend who believes in you completely. As they wheeled Lucy away, she gave James a small salute, the kind she'd seen him perform the day before. James stood at attention and saluted her back, this time not caring who might see or what protocols he might be breaking. Mrs. Patterson embraced him as they watched Lucy disappear around the corner. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for showing her that strangers can become friends, that there's still goodness in the world. James drove back to his own hospital with a heavy heart, but also with something he hadn't felt in months: hope. Lucy's courage had reminded him that children possess a strength that adults often underestimate, and that sometimes the most meaningful battles are fought not by soldiers in uniforms, but by small children in hospital gowns. James arrived at Emma's hospital to find his daughter awake and unusually animated. Sarah was sitting beside the bed showing Emma something on her phone with an expression James couldn't quite read. Daddy, Emma called out as he entered the room. Mommy showed me the video of you on the internet. You're famous. James looked at Sarah questioningly. She held up her phone, revealing the now viral video of his interaction with Lucy. The view count had climbed to over 2 million, and the comment section was filled with messages of support and gratitude. The nurses have been talking about it all day, Sarah explained. Apparently, several staff members recognized you from the video. Emma's been so proud, telling everyone that her daddy is the famous guard who helped the sick little girl. James sat on the edge of Emma's bed, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. What do you think about it, Em? I think you did the right thing, Emma said with the matter-of-fact certainty that children possess. If I was that little girl, I would have wanted someone to notice me too. Sometimes when you're sick, people look at you like you're different, but you made her feel special instead of different. The wisdom in his daughter's words struck James powerfully. Emma understood, perhaps better than any adult could, exactly what that moment at the palace gates had meant to Lucy. Actually, "I have a message for you from Lucy," James said, remembering the whispered words from the hospital. "She wanted me to tell you that Lucy the guard says hello, and that you're both fighting the same battle and you're going to win together." Emma's eyes widened. "She knows about me? She's a very smart girl, just like someone else I know," James replied, kissing Emma's forehead. "She wanted me to tell you that you're both brave guards fighting an important battle." Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. News outlets around the world picked up the video, and it became a symbol of human compassion overcoming rigid protocol. The palace, initially concerned about the breach of tradition, found itself dealing with an unprecedented wave of positive publicity. More importantly for James, the story seemed to have struck a chord with families facing similar struggles. His email inbox filled with messages from parents of sick children, thanking him for the moment of hope he'd provided. Many shared their own stories of small kindnesses that had made enormous differences during their darkest days. One message particularly moved him. It came from a father in Australia whose son was undergoing cancer treatment. "My boy saw your video and said he wants to be a guard like you when he grows up. Not because of the uniform or the palace, but because you showed him that real guards protect people's feelings, not just buildings." 3 days after Lucy's surgery, James received a call from Mrs. Patterson. Lucy had come through the operation successfully, though she would face a long recovery period. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Lucy was asking when she could see her guard friend again. That evening, James made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Sergeant Morrison and requested a meeting about something that had been growing in his mind since meeting Lucy. "Sir," James began the next morning in Morrison's office, "I've been thinking about the reaction to what happened with Lucy, and I wonder if we're missing an opportunity." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "What kind of opportunity?" "There are children in hospitals all over London who might benefit from visits from the guards. Not official ceremonies or photo opportunities, just human contact. I know it's not traditional, but neither was what I did at the gates, and look how much good came from that." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "You're talking about creating some kind of official program?" "Maybe not official at first," James replied. "But maybe a few of us could volunteer our free time to visit sick children. Show them that guards are real people who care about them. I think it could mean a lot to families who are struggling." Morrison smiled. "Actually, James, you're not the first person to suggest this. The palace has received dozens of requests from hospitals and families, asking if other guards might be willing to make similar visits. The Public Relations Department thinks it could be a wonderful way to modernize the image of the guard while serving the community." James felt a surge of excitement. "Really? Really? In fact, they'd like you to help develop the program. You'd still maintain your regular duties, but you'd also coordinate visits and help train other guards who want to participate." The idea of turning his spontaneous act of compassion into something larger and more systematic felt like a gift. James thought about all the children like Emma and Lucy, fighting battles that most adults couldn't imagine, and how much a simple visit from someone in uniform might brighten their day. 2 weeks later, the first official visit of what would become known as the Guard Angels program took place. James, along with 2 other volunteers from his regiment, visited a children's ward at Great Ormond Street Hospital. They came not in their ceremonial uniforms, but in dress uniforms that were more practical for hospital environments. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Children who had been withdrawn and quiet suddenly became animated and engaged. Parents who had been carrying the weight of their children's illnesses alone suddenly felt supported by this unexpected show of care from strangers. During that first visit, James met Tommy, a 6-year-old boy who had been in the hospital for 3 months following a serious accident. Tommy had barely spoken since his admission, worrying his parents and doctors alike. But when James sat beside his bed and began telling stories about the funny things that happened during guard duty, Tommy started to giggle. By the end of the visit, he was asking questions and even attempting his own version of a military salute. Tommy's mother pulled James aside as he was leaving. "He hasn't laughed like that since the accident," she said through tears. I had forgotten what his laugh sounded like. Thank you for giving that back to us. As James drove home that evening, he realized that what had started as a moment of human connection with one little girl had evolved into something much larger. The rigid protocols that had once defined his service were being balanced with a new understanding of what it meant to truly serve others. He thought about Emma, who was responding well to her latest treatment, and about Lucy, who was slowly recovering from her surgery. Both girls had taught him that sometimes the most important duty a person could perform had nothing to do with following rules, and everything to do with recognizing the humanity in others. 6 months after that fateful day at the palace gates, the Guard Angels program had grown beyond James's wildest expectations. What had started as an informal arrangement between a few guards and local hospitals had evolved into an official palace initiative, with over 30 guards volunteering their time in hospitals across London requesting visits. James found himself balancing his traditional duties with his new role as program coordinator. But he had never felt more fulfilled in his career. Each visit reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place, not for the pageantry or tradition, but to make a positive difference in people's lives. The program had also caught the attention of international media, with news crews from around the world documenting the guards' hospital visits. But for James, the real measure of success wasn't media coverage or public recognition. It was the letters and photos that arrived daily from children and families whose lives had been touched by a guard's visit. Emma's condition had stabilized significantly, and she was now considered to be in remission. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but more importantly, Emma herself had regained much of her childhood enthusiasm. She had become an unofficial ambassador for the Guard Angels program, often accompanying James to hospitals when her health permitted, and helping other sick children understand that they weren't alone in their battles. Lucy, meanwhile, had made a remarkable recovery from her surgery. The operation had been successful, and while she still faced ongoing treatment, her prognosis was much more positive than anyone had dared hope. She and Mrs. Patterson had returned to their home in Manchester, but they stayed in regular contact with James and even visited London monthly for her medical appointments. During one of these visits, Lucy asked to return to Buckingham Palace. Standing at the same spot where their first encounter had taken place, she watched the guards with a different kind of appreciation. She understood now that beneath the ceremonial uniforms were real people, with real hearts. People who cared enough to break tradition when compassion demanded it. "Do you think other people know?" Lucy asked James as they watched the changing of the guard ceremony. "Know what?" James replied. "That the guards are really just people who care about other people." James smiled. "I think more people are starting to understand that now, thanks to you." The ripple effects of that initial moment of human connection had spread far beyond anything James could have imagined. The video of his interaction with Lucy had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, spawning countless conversations about the balance between tradition and humanity, duty and compassion. But perhaps more significantly, it had inspired similar programs in other countries. Royal Guards in Sweden had started visiting children's hospitals, and even the traditionally rigid guards at various historical sites around Europe had begun incorporating small acts of human kindness into their duties. James received letters from guards around the world, thanking him for showing them that strength and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. One letter from a guard in Copenhagen particularly moved him. "You helped me understand that the greatest honor isn't in following rules perfectly, but in knowing when humanity should take precedence over protocol." The palace administration, initially nervous about the precedent James had set, now proudly promoted the Guard Angels program as an example of the monarchy's connection to ordinary citizens. Queen Elizabeth herself had privately commended James for his actions, and there were rumors that the program might be expanded to include other royal residences. During a particularly busy week in November, James found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. He was preparing for 3 hospital visits, training 2 new volunteers for the program, and helping to organize a special event where recovered children would be invited to tour the palace and meet the guards. Emma burst into his study while he was working on the event planning, waving a letter excitedly. "Daddy, look what came in the mail today!" The letter was from a hospital in Canada, written by a young boy named Marcus who had seen the Guard Angels program featured on a television documentary. Marcus was fighting the same type of brain tumor that Lucy had faced, and his parents had shown him the video of James and Lucy's first meeting to give him hope during his treatment. "Dear Guard James, The letter read in careful 8-year-old handwriting. My mom showed me the video of you and Lucy. I'm sick too, but seeing how brave Lucy was makes me want to be brave like her. I don't have any guard friends where I live, but I pretend sometimes that you're watching over me during my treatments. Thank you for showing me that grown-ups can care about kids. They don't even... No. James felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he realized how far-reaching the impact of that single moment had become. Each letter, each story, each child who found courage through the program reminded him that sometimes the smallest gestures could create the largest changes. Can we write back to Marcus? Emma asked, already reaching for paper and colored pencils. Of course we can, James replied, and maybe we can put him in touch with Lucy too. I think they'd like each other. That evening, as James sat down to write to Marcus, he reflected on the chain of connections that had formed since that day at the palace gates. Lucy had connected him to his own capacity for compassion. Emma had shown him that children possessed wisdom adults often missed. The other families they'd met through the program had taught him that everyone was fighting battles others couldn't see. The program had also changed the other participating guards in unexpected ways. Corporal Williams, initially skeptical about the program, had become one of its most dedicated volunteers after meeting a young girl who reminded him of his own daughter. Sergeant Davis discovered that his military experience helped him connect with children facing medical procedures, giving them strategies for dealing with fear and uncertainty. Even the palace staff had been affected. Nurses from various hospitals had started reaching out not just to request guard visits, but to share stories about how the children's attitudes and recovery times had improved after these encounters. Medical professionals were beginning to recognize the healing power of hope and human connection in ways that traditional medicine sometimes overlooked. As Christmas approached, James was asked to speak at a medical conference about the psychological benefits of the Guard Angels program. Standing before an audience of doctors, nurses, and child psychologists, he felt far removed from his comfort zone as a ceremonial guard. 6 months ago, I was trained to show no emotion, to be a symbol rather than a person, James began his speech. But I learned that day that the highest form of service isn't about following rules perfectly. It's about recognizing when human need should override protocol. He talked about Lucy's courage, Emma's wisdom, and the dozens of other children who had taught him that strength came in many forms. He explained how the guards themselves had benefited from the program, finding new purpose in their service and a deeper connection to the people they ultimately served. Every child we visit teaches us something, James concluded. They show us that vulnerability and bravery can coexist, that hope can flourish in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on battlefields, but in hospital rooms by the smallest warriors among us. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several hospitals requesting to implement similar programs with local military or ceremonial units. The idea was spreading organically, driven not by official mandates but by the recognition that human connection was a powerful force for healing. As the year drew to a close, James received an invitation that would mark another significant milestone in the program's evolution. The Queen herself had requested a private meeting to discuss the Guard Angels initiative and its future expansion. The day of James's meeting with Queen Elizabeth was crisp and clear, one of those perfect London mornings that made the palace grounds look like something from a fairy tale. As he walked through corridors he had protected for over 2 decades, James felt a different kind of nervousness than he had ever experienced during his ceremonial duties. This wasn't about following protocol. This was about explaining how breaking protocol had led to something beautiful. The private audience took place in one of the Queen's smaller receiving rooms, a space that managed to be both grand and intimate. When the Queen entered, James stood at attention, but she immediately gestured for him to sit. "Sergeant Mitchell," she began with a warm smile, "I've been following the Guard Angels program with great interest. I wanted to meet the man who had the courage to put humanity before protocol." "Your Majesty," James replied carefully, "I hope my actions didn't bring any dishonor to the Guard or to your service." The Queen's expression grew thoughtful. "On the contrary, I believe you demonstrated the very best of what service means. Tell me about that day, about what you were thinking when you decided to acknowledge young Lucy." James found himself sharing the story from a perspective he had never articulated before. Not just the external events, But the internal struggle between duty and compassion, his thoughts about Emma, and the split-second decision that had changed everything. "I've been following Lucy's recovery," the Queen said when he finished. "And your daughter Emma's as well. How are they both doing?" James was touched that the Queen had taken the time to inquire about the children. "Both are doing well, Your Majesty. Lucy has responded wonderfully to her treatment, and Emma has been in remission for several months now. They've become friends through all of this. They write letters and encourage each other. And the program itself? How has it affected the guards who participate?" "It's changed us all," James replied honestly. "We joined the Guard to serve, but many of us had never experienced service in such a personal way. When you see a child's face light up because someone in uniform took time to notice them, when you watch families find hope in the darkest moments, it reminds you why service matters." The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "I've received reports from the hospitals. The medical staff says they've seen measurable improvements in children's attitudes and even recovery times after Guard visits. That's remarkable. The children teach us more than we teach them," James said. "They show us what real courage looks like. A 7-year-old facing surgery with a smile is braver than any soldier I've known." "I have a proposal for you," the Queen said, leaning forward slightly. "I would like to make the Guard Angels program an official royal initiative, with you as its director. This would mean expanding it beyond London, training guards at other royal residences, and perhaps even working with military units in other Commonwealth countries." James felt his heart racing. The idea of turning their small program into something that could help children around the world was both thrilling and overwhelming. "Your Majesty, I'm honored, but I should mention that I'm not the only one who deserves credit. The other guards who volunteer, the hospital staff who support us, the families who trust us with their children, it's been a team effort from the beginning. Which is exactly why I believe you're the right person to lead it," the Queen replied. "Leadership isn't about taking credit. It's about recognizing that the best achievements come from bringing out the best in others." 3 months later, the expanded Guard Angels program was officially launched with a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Lucy, now healthier and more spirited than ever, was invited to cut the ribbon alongside Emma and several other children who had been part of the program's early days. The ceremony was covered by media from around the world, but for James, the most meaningful moment came when Lucy approached him after the formal proceedings. "James," she said, using the informal name she had called him since their first meeting in the hospital, "do you remember what you told me about being brave? That being brave means being scared but doing it anyway? Yes, I want to tell you something. You were brave that day at the palace, too. You were probably scared to break the rules, but you did it anyway because it was the right thing to do." James knelt down to Lucy's level, struck once again by the wisdom that children possessed. "You know what, Lucy? You're absolutely right. I was terrified. But you did it anyway," Lucy said with a grin. "Just like I did with my surgery, just like Emma did with her treatments. We're all brave together." As the ceremony concluded and the children played on the palace grounds, James stood with Emma and Sarah, watching Lucy chase pigeons with the same energy that any healthy 8-year-old might display. The transformation was remarkable. From the frail child in a wheelchair to this vibrant little girl who had become a symbol of hope for so many others. The program had grown to include over 100 guards across the United Kingdom, with similar initiatives starting in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Hospitals reported not only improved morale among young patients, but also increased job satisfaction among medical staff who witnessed these interactions. But perhaps the most significant change was in the guards themselves. What had started as a breach of protocol had evolved into a new understanding of what service truly meant. They had learned that strength could be gentle, that discipline could coexist with compassion, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with kindness. James's story had become a case study in leadership programs, a reminder that individual actions could create systemic change, and that sometimes the greatest courage was required not to follow orders, but to follow one's conscience. As the sun set over the palace grounds that evening, James reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple nod to a sick little girl. It had taught him that behind every uniform, every title, every role that society assigns, there is a human being capable of extraordinary compassion. The Stoic facade that had once defined his service remained when duty required it, but it no longer defined who he was as a person. He had learned that the greatest honor wasn't in being unfeeling, but in caring deeply enough to act when action mattered most. And in hospital rooms across the country, children facing their own battles would continue to find hope in the visits of guards who understood that true service meant seeing each person, no matter how small, how sick, or how scared, as someone worthy of recognition, respect, and love.